themselves and dispatches to Bushire. From this place they proceeded to Bombay, but of all the company only 2 survived, a Mr. Jowell, an officer of a merchant ship, and an English sailor named Penmel, together with the bag of letters and dispatches. In the following year 2 English brigs, the Shannon, Captain Babcock, and the Trimmer, Captain Cummings, were on their voyage from Bombay to Bussorah. These were both attacked near the islands of Polior and Ken by several boats, and after a slight resistance on the part of the Shannon only, were taken possession of, and a part of the crew of each cruelly put to the sword. Captain Babcock, having been seen by one of the Arabs to discharge a musket during the contest, was taken by them on shore, and after a consultation on his fate, it was determined that he should forfeit the arm by which this act of resistance was committed. It was accordingly severed from his body by one stroke of a sabre, and no steps were taken either to bind up the wound or to prevent his bleeding to death. The captain himself had yet sufficient presence of mind left, however, to think of his own safety, and there being left near him some clarified butter, he procured this to be heated, and while yet warm, thrust the bleeding stump of his arm into it. It had the effect of lessening the effusion of blood, and ultimately of saving a life that would otherwise most probably have been lost. The crew were then all made prisoners, and taken to a port of Arabia, from whence they gradually dispersed and escaped. The vessels themselves were additionally armed, one of them mounting 20 guns, manned with Arab crews, and sent from Ras al Khaimah to cruise in the Gulf, where they committed many piracies. In the year 1808, the force of the Joassamees having gradually increased, and becoming flushed with the pride of victory, their insulting attacks on the British flag were more numerous and more desperate than ever. The first of these was on the ship Minerva of Bombay, on her voyage to Bussorah. The attack was commenced by several boats, for they never cruise singly, and a spirited resistance in a running fight was kept up at intervals for several days in succession. A favorable moment offered, however, for boarding. The ship was overpowered by numbers and carried amidst a general massacre. The captain was said to have been cut up into separate pieces and thrown overboard by fragments. The second mate and carpenter alone were spared, probably to make use of their services, and an Armenian lady, the wife of Lieutenant Taylor, then at Bushire, was reserved perhaps for still greater sufferings, but was subsequently ransomed for a large sum. A few weeks after this, the Sylph, one of the East India Company's cruisers, of 60 tons and mounting 8 guns, was accompanying the mission under Sir Hartford Jones from Bombay to Persia, when being separated from the rest of the squadron, she was attacked in the Gulf by a fleet of dhows. These bore down with all the menacing attitude of hostility, but as the commander, Lieutenant Graham, had received orders from the Bombay government not to open his fire on any of these vessels until he had been first fired on himself, the ship was hardly prepared for battle, and the colors were not even hoisted to apprise them to what nation she belonged. The dhows approached, threw their long overhanging prows across the Sylph's beam, and pouring in a shower of stones on her deck, beat down and wounded almost everyone who stood on it. They then boarded, and made the ship an easy prize, before more than a single shot had been fired, and in their usual way put everyone whom they found alive to the sword. Lieutenant Graham fell, covered with wounds, down the fore hatchway of his own vessel, where he was dragged by some of the crew into a storeroom, in which they had secreted themselves, and barricaded the door with a crowbar from within. The cruiser was thus completely in the possession of the enemy, who made sail on her, and were bearing her off in triumph to their own port, in company with their boats. Soon after, however, the commodore of the squadron, in the Nereid frigate, hove in sight, and perceiving this vessel in company with the dhows, judged her to be a prize to the pirates. She accordingly gave them all chase, and coming up with a brig, the Arabs took to their boats and abandoned her. The chase was continued after the dhows, but without success. These repeated aggressions at length opened the eyes of the East India government, and an expedition was accordingly assembled at Bombay. The naval force consisted of La Chiffone frigate, Captain Wainwright as commodore, the Caroline of 38 guns, and 8 of the East India Company's cruisers, namely, the Mornington, Ternate, Aurora, Prince of Wales, Ariel, Nautilus, Vestal, and Fury, with 4 large transports, and the Stromboli bomb ketch. The fleet sailed from Bombay in September, and after a long passage they reached Muscat, where they remained for many days to refresh and arrange their future plans. They sailed and soon reached Ras el Khyma, the chief port of the pirates within the Gulf. Here the squadron anchored abreast of the town, and the troops were landed under cover of the ships and boats. The inhabitants of the town assembled in crowds to repel the invaders, but the firm line, the regular volleys, and the steady charge of the troops at the point of the bayonet overcame every obstacle, and multiplied the heaps of the slain. A general conflagration was then ordered, and a general plunder to the troops was permitted. The town was set on fire in all parts, and about 60 sails of boats and dhows, with the Minerva, a ship which they had taken, then lying in the roads, were all burnt and destroyed. The complete conquest of the place was thus effected with very trifling loss on the part of the besiegers, and some plunder collected, though it was thought that most of the treasure and valuables had been removed into the interior. This career of victory was suddenly damped by the report of the approach of a large body of troops from the interior, and although none of these were seen, this ideal reinforcement induced the besiegers to withdraw. The embarkation took place at daylight in the morning, and while the fleet remained at anchor during the whole of the day, parties were still seen assembling on the shore, displaying their colors, brandishing their spears, and firing muskets from all points, so that the conquest was scarcely as complete as could be wished, since no formal act of submission had yet been shown. The expedition now sailed to Linga, a small port of the Joassamees, and burnt it to the ground. The force had now become separated, the greater portion of the troops being sent to Muscat for supplies, or being deemed unnecessary, and some of the vessels were sent on separate services of blockading passages and etc. The remaining portion of the blockading squadron, consisting of La Chiffone frigate, and 4 of the cruisers, the Mornington, Ternate, Nautilus, and Fury, and 2 transports, with 500 troops from Linga, then proceeded to Luft, another port of the Joassamees. As the channel here was narrow and difficult of approach, the ships were warped into their stations of anchorage, and a summons sent on shore, as the people had not here abandoned their town, but were found at their posts of defense, in a large and strong castle with many batteries, redoubts, and etc. The summon being treated with disdain, the troops were landed with Colonel Smith at their head, and while forming on the beach, a slight skirmish took place with such of the inhabitants of the town as fled for shelter to the castle. The troops then advanced towards the fortress, which is described to have had walls 14 feet thick, pierced with loopholes, and only one entrance through a small gate, well cased with iron bars and bolts, in the strongest manner. With a howitzer taken for the occasion, it was intended to have blown this gate open, and to have taken the place by storm, but on reaching it, while the ranks opened, and the men sought to surround the castle to seek for some other entrance, at the same time, they were picked off so rapidly and unexpectedly from the loopholes above, that a general flight took place. The howitzer was abandoned, even before it had been fired, and both the officers and the troops sought shelter by lying down behind the ridges of sand and little hillocks immediately underneath the castle walls. An Irish officer, jumping up from his hiding place and calling on some of his comrades to follow him in an attempt to rescue the howitzer, was killed in the enterprise. Such others as even raised their heads to look around them were picked off by the musketry from above, and the whole of the troops lay therefore hidden in this way, until the darkness of night favored their escape to the beach, where they embarked after sunset, the enemy having made no sally on them from the fort. A second summons was sent to the chief in the castle, threatening to bombard the town from a nearer anchorage if he did not submit, and no quarter afterwards shown. With the dawn of morning all eyes were directed to the fortress, when, to the surprise of the whole squadron, a man was seen waving the British Union flag on the summit of its walls. It was Lieutenant Hall, who commanded the Fury, which was one of the vessels nearest the shore. During the night he had gone on shore alone, taking a Union Jack in his hand, and advanced singly to the castle gate. The fortress had already been abandoned by the greater number of inhabitants, but some few still remained there. These fled at the approach of an individual, supposing him to be the herald of those who were to follow. Be this as it may, the castle was entirely abandoned, and the British flag waved on its walls by this